his reaction to the sacking. And we're going to have much, much more on the Camilla Tominey show this morning. But first, here's the news headlines with Bethany Elsey.
Camilla, thank you. Good morning. It's 9:30. I'm Bethany Elsey with your top stories from the GB newsroom. As you've been hearing, Nadhim Zahawi has been sacked from the government over what the Prime Minister described as a serious breach of the ministerial code. The Tory party chair had come under increasing pressure over his tax affairs after admitting he paid a penalty to HMRC. He says the error over his shares in the polling company YouGov was careless. The Housing Secretary has admitted the faulty government guidance allowed the Grenfell Tower tragedy to happen. Michael Gove told the Sunday Times the government didn't police the whole system of building safety effectively enough. Tomorrow, Mr Gove will announce a 6-week deadline for developers to sign a contract to fix their unsafe homes or be banned from building new ones. The fire at the residential tower block in West London in 2017 killed 72 people. The government will publish an urgent emergency care plan tomorrow to try and tackle pressures on the NHS. It comes as the Health Department have announced plans to build virtual beds, caring for tens of thousands of elderly and vulnerable people at home. It's part of a strategy by the Health Department to shift some NHS care away from hospitals. The Health Secretary admitted there was no quick fix to the service, but this immediate action would reduce waiting times. You're up to date on TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Now it's back to Camilla.
Well, I do love the smell of breaking news on a Sunday morning. We've kind of torn up what I was going to say this morning because we obviously now have this breaking news of Nadhim Zahawi's sacking by the Prime Minister. I'll just give you the killer line in this letter from 10 Downing Street. It is clear that there has been a serious breach of the ministerial code. As a result, I have informed you of my decision to remove you from your position in His Majesty's government. Couldn't be more clearer than that. We're going to be discussing all that and more. We've got Jacob Rees-Mogg coming on the show, our new GB News signing. He's going to be speaking to us a little later live from Somerset. Very interested to hear his reaction to this breaking news. I'm also going to be speaking to Gerard Lyons, who is Boris Johnson's former economics advisor, about Jeremy Hunt's statement in the week that now wasn't the time to cut taxes. And with the transgender debate continuing to rage in today's papers, I'm going to be speaking to leading feminist Julie Bindel. Let's just take you through the headlines, which sometimes can seem out of date, even just hours after they've been published. Here's the front page of the Sunday Times. Gove, we share the blame for Grenfell deaths. In the Sunday Telegraph, hospitals at home plan to save NHS. Front of the Mail goes with a royal story, the Mail on Sunday. King to Welby, I want Harry at coronation. The Sunday Mirror, more tales of alleged Tory sleaze. Top Tories Russian oil millions. The Observer, it does have the Zahawi story down page, but its main headline today is I saw children face bullying and racism at Asylum Hotel. The Sun on Sunday is carrying a story about Strictly stars in 3 a.m. bottle bust-up. And then in the Sunday Express, Rishi at war over migrants. But actually, as I bring in my paper reviewer, Michael Portillo, former Defence Secretary and my fellow GB News presenter, actually, I think Rishi is at war over more than migrants this morning. We've torn up our original plans for the paper review, haven't we, Michael? And we're going straight into this story. It does feature, and the writing was on the wall, because there's a long read in the Sunday Times, there's articles about his future, and we were discussing in the green room, weren't we, that you thought it was going to be a case of today that he would go.
We did a little promo a few moments ago and we said that we thought he wouldn't last the day, and there we are. A few moments later, he was gone. And it's slightly curious in a way that the Sunday papers didn't have more of a smell of this about to happen. So how do we assess it? I think it's a terrific blow against the government and the Prime Minister. Not so much the losing of the individual, although I think he did do distinguished work, for example, during the vaccinations campaign. But people hate the idea that a senior minister is filthy rich and not paying the taxes up front and quickly and in the way that the rest of us feel that we have to pay our taxes. This is extremely toxic with the public. The second thing about it is that obviously Rishi Sunak is accused by some people of pursuing natural justice too far.
Yes.
That he wanted to go through all the proper processes, which in a way is very commendable. But this thing has been in the headlines now for days and days and days, and it's been doing terrible damage to the government and to the party. I think he did have an opportunity to get rid of him earlier. The opportunity was that evidently Nadhim Zahawi had not been frank with the Prime Minister about what had happened in the past. And I might simply have said, well, I don't know yet what there is to find out here, but because you didn't tell me, I think I'm justified in sacking you straight away.
I can't work out whether this all makes Rishi Sunak look stronger or weaker. Because, yes, there's been an expedited process with bringing in Sir Laurie Magnus to have a look at it independently. But many people were saying at the beginning of the week, this entire farrago is overshadowing everything you're trying to do, everything that Jeremy Hunt is trying to announce. I mean, you've been in this situation where other news events overshadow your own central message. This has been a completely unwelcome distraction.
And curiously, there's some evidence that the Prime Minister had made his mind up some days ago, because when he was talking about Nadhim Zahawi in the House of Commons, he did not refer to him as my right honourable friend. He referred to him as the Minister, which is, you know, pretty uncourteous.
Unfriendly.
Unfriendly and almost discourteous way of talking about it in the House of Commons. So I think the Prime Minister will face some criticism for having taken so long. It's been fortunate for him in a way that Sir Laurie Magnus has delivered, obviously, an unambiguous finding, which has led to that absolutely crushing sentence in the letter.
Let's just go to that finding in Laurie Magnus's letter here to the Prime Minister. Mr Zahawi failed to meet the requirement, it's at paragraph 7.3 of the Ministerial Code, if you're that way inclined, to declare any interest which might be thought to give rise to a conflict. So it seems really clear in the independent investigator's mind here that there was a conflict of interest, there was a breach of the code. Having said that, again, you could say, well, couldn't the Prime Minister see that? Most people looking at it, journalistically or otherwise, could see that there was a gaping hole here. I
think you've answered your own question of a moment ago, haven't you? Does this make Rishi look strong or weak? It pains me to say this, but I think on the whole, it makes him look weak. I think he must have been biting, kicking himself all week that he decided to refer this to Sir Laurie Magnus rather than going with a decision straight away, because that took the timing then out of his hands. I don't know whether he would have chosen to do it on a Sunday morning, but we've had a week's worth of that. And by the way, it's like when one shoe drops, you expect the next two, because now lots of people are going to be talking about Dominic Raab.
Yes.
And just to remind ourselves, he is actually the Deputy Prime Minister, as well as being the Justice Secretary. So if there is a second casualty in coming weeks, I would guess, then, that'll be another savage blow to the government. This government under Rishi Sunak has only been here 100 days.
Yes, and actually there'd been some long reads during the weekend's papers about his first 100 days in office, and people were kind of criticising it for being too lacklustre and not interesting enough. It's just become interesting in the last hour. You picked for quote of the week, again on Zahawi, was in Tim Shipman's long read in the Sunday Times. Few ministerial colleagues believe Zahawi will survive. Well, he was very prescient on that prediction. They are similarly pessimistic about prospects for Raab, the Deputy Prime Minister. You did just mention him there, Michael. Again, I mean, to have one minister kind of embroiled in a scandal is careless. To find two is positively suicidal. This is difficult, isn't it? He's Deputy Prime Minister. I appreciate he's innocent before proven guilty, but the trouble is, more accusations have come to light. It doesn't look good for him at all.
The Prime Minister begins his letter, doesn't he, by reasserting the commitment that he made when he became Prime Minister to integrity in government. So having reasserted that, it's going to be quite difficult for him to assert that someone who may be found guilty of bullying should continue in the government. So, again, I think the expectation, you read out that paragraph from the Sunday Times, I think the expectation is that Dominic Raab may not last very long.
No. Let's look already. Mail on Sunday, page 2, we're looking at runners and riders. Apparently there was this away day at Chequers on Thursday, and a few different cabinet ministers were jockeying for position. There's a vacancy now, clear and open vacancy. Can I propose something, Michael? This might be anathema to you, but let's just put it out there. Tory chairman, more than a year out from a general election. You need a very solid campaigner in that role. Is this the moment that Boris Johnson stages a comeback?
Boris Johnson is undoubtedly the best election winner in British politics today. And there are people who think that the Conservative Party has been unwise to get rid of him as leader and Prime Minister. But he is still embroiled in a number of very difficult situations. One of them is over the appointment of Richard Sharp at the BBC. Another one still goes back to whether he misled the House during the Partygate and COVID stuff. Also, there is no doubt at all that he would completely overshadow the Prime Minister. Yes. And so for those three reasons, I'm going to say absolutely not.
But they're facing potentially sort of electoral annihilation. You'll be familiar with how horrific and humiliating that might be for a number of MPs on election night. I mean, the polls are looking dreadful for them. We saw the GBNews poll this week said that the Labour Party won 50 and that the Tories were 22% behind.
Yes.
So there's a mountain to climb.
I understand all of that, but I think this horse has bolted. I mean, if the Conservative Party wanted Boris Johnson to win an election for them, they should have kept him as leader, where indeed he might have won the election for them, or at least he might not have lost it very badly, which I think is the more probable
Was
outcome.
it a mistake finally, Michael, to get rid of him in light of everything that's happened today, let alone the last 100 days?
The party was in a very, very difficult position. But if you want me to say yes or no, I think they would have lost less badly under Boris than under Rishi.
Thank you very much. That's Michael Portillo, who will be with you at 11 o'clock today. He's going to make a mad dash from this studio to the other GB News studio in Paddington. Now, the People's Panel, I'm sure, will have their opinions on what has just happened in the last hour. Paul Hawkins is in Milton Keynes. Don't forget, if you want to apply, you can go to gbnews.uk/panel. Paul, dying to know what the people of Milton Keynes make of what's happened in the last hour.
Yeah, morning Camilla, and welcome to Milton Keynes. We're at the Calabria Cafe. It's Sunday morning, nice quiet morning, and then the Conservative Party chairman's been sacked. So let's find out what the people think then. Let's start with Steph. Steph, how are you feeling this morning about Nadeem Zahawi being sacked?
Well, I think he should have gone straight away. I mean, it's not setting a good example, is it, if he's the chairman and chancellor, when he was the chancellor, to renegotiate your tax burden.
Yeah, and what do you think it says? And I'm really interested to find out what you think as well, because you're a former Conservative member, but now you've joined Reform, is that right?
I have
joined
Reform.
So what does it say about, for various reasons we should add, but what does it say about the judgment of Rishi Sunak?
Well, it's really poor judgment, actually. He obviously knew what was going on, and then not to get rid of him straight away is poor.
Yeah.
Very poor.
Yeah. Peter, over here, former laser physicist Peter, how are you feeling about Rishi Sunak being sacked?
No, Rishi Sunak didn't get sacked.
Nadeem Zahawi.
Nadeem got sacked. I think it's a real shame that a quality, good person has to go, but he should have resigned. And, you know, people that are high earners, they all use tax advisors of one sort and another. So it's just he's been caught out, but he should have known better.
Well, he did pay the penalty. This is him being sacked for breaking the ministerial code, which is something a little bit different.
Yeah, the ministerial code, he shouldn't be in a position of power, and certainly as a former chancellor, I mean, that's pretty poor, actually, and it doesn't paint a good picture on the government whatsoever. But we have to move on. He should have resigned. He's been fired, so Rishi Sunak's actually done the right thing, I think.
Yeah. Who would you like to see as chairman of the Conservative Party now?
As chairman, well, Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Perfect example, yeah.
Yeah. He might have something to say about that. One man who knows a thing or two about sticking to the law is former policeman Chris. Chris, Nadeem Zahawi.
I think it was inevitable, really. It should have stood down in the very first place when there was a question mark about this whole issue. All it's done is it's distracted from a lot of core business over the last couple of days. I don't think it was sustainable. I don't know too much about the breaking the ministerial code and what that entailed, but nonetheless, it's optics. It looks very poor, and again, it's about standards and what people perceive as being a higher standard, especially in public life, holding people to account, and then the fact it's taken a few days it's poor judgment, really.
Well, Rishi Sunak said he was going to await the outcome of an investigation from his independent ethics advisor, and you're a man who's used to investigations as a former policeman yourself. Why didn't that happen?
Well, from my understanding, a lot of people in government saw this as kicking the can down the road to a certain extent and giving breathing space. But the trouble is, of course, it's the media, the press. You know, it's been front and centre every day since, and it's true. I mean, we would normally wait, of course, until the final outcome. Shouldn't judge people just on rumour and speculation, but the man is in high office, and I think he should have taken a step back and then await the outcome of the investigation.
All right, Chris, Steph, Peter, thank you. So the interesting thing, of course, about all of this is that we're talking now about Nadeem Zahawi. In fact, he's been sacked as Conservative Party chairman, and we're not talking about those 4 or 5 priorities that Rishi Sunak set out. And he will hope that by drawing a line under this, by getting rid of Nadeem Zahawi as Conservative Party chairman, they'll be able to talk about policy and not about internal Conservative Party politics and the ministerial code.
In Milton Keynes. Again, if you want to apply, go to gbnews.uk/panel. Also, I'd love to hear your views on what's happened this morning. Please do email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk. Now, Peter in Milton Keynes thinks that Jacob Rees-Mogg might make a good replacement for Nadeem Zahawi. He joins me now, the former Business Secretary and MP for North East Somerset. Jacob, I hope you can hear me from there. Thank you for joining me on the Sabbath. As a lapsed Catholic, I can do this work, but I'm very grateful for your time. What's your reaction to the news that the Prime Minister has sacked Nadeem Zahawi?
Well, I feel very sorry for Nadeem, who I think is a very decent man, has been a very successful businessman and an effective politician. And the report seems to show that he made some technical errors with his declarations under the ministerial code. And the Prime Minister has decided that they were serious enough to fire him. So I feel sorry for Nadeem Zahawi. But I think that after it dominating the headlines for a week, the rule of politics is that if you do that, it's very hard to remain in office. And so the Prime Minister was under great pressure to get a new party chairman.
Should he have acted sooner, though, Jacob? I mean, it has dominated the headlines. It's overpowered his own message. It's overshadowed Jeremy Hunt's speech in the week, which I'm going to get onto with you in a moment. This has gone on too long, hasn't it?
I mean, I think that's a very difficult question to answer, because you don't want Prime Ministers to be bounced into replacing members of their cabinet the whole time. And this is the second member of the cabinet who has had to go after Gavin Williamson. That the opposition are always in the hunt for their next scalp, so to speak. And Prime Ministers have to be aware of that, and there has to be a reasonably high standard for resignations. There also has to be some loyalty to the team that is around you, otherwise you won't get loyalty in return. So I don't think it's as easy as saying as soon as there's any whiff of controversy, a minister must go. Otherwise, you'd find it very difficult to keep any ministers.
Although, as a Boris backer, you might say that what goes around comes around. I mean, Nadeem Zahawi was among those who brought Boris Johnson down.
Well, no, I don't think Nadeem was particularly, actually. I mean, he accepted the appointment as Chancellor. He may then have briefly wavered overnight, but I don't think he was instrumental in bringing Boris down. As you know, I think it was a mistake to remove Boris Johnson, who was an excellent leader of the Conservative Party and is the biggest figure in British political life, even out of office.
Should he be brought back into the cabinet then as the new party chairman, Jacob?
I think it's very difficult to bring back Boris Johnson in a subordinate role, that he's such a big figure that he would dominate any cabinet that he was in, even as a less senior figure than Prime Minister. So I think that would be very hard to do. But he has all the right attributes for a party chairman. He is charismatic, he rallies the troops, he's a sort of fully leaded Conservative. So I think that type of personality would be a very good one for party chairman.
Well, it doesn't sound like you're ruling it out. I mean, Peter in Milton Keynes, Jacob, has suggested that you might also fulfil that role.
Well, when it turned out it was somebody called Peter, I thought perhaps one of my children had got on the line and was suggesting office for me. But it's very flattering of him. But I think the Prime Minister needs to appoint as party chairman, if you look at the most successful party chairman, somebody who is very close to him politically. So John Major and Chris Patten were a very effective team. Margaret Thatcher was very effective with Cecil Parkinson particularly. And it is one of the really important roles, particularly in the run-up to an election. So the Prime Minister would be well advised to have one of his closest allies in that role.
Are you saying that Boris Johnson isn't a close ally? I mean, they work together very closely as Chancellor and Prime Minister. And as everyone keeps on saying on this show this morning, Boris Johnson is the most effective campaigner for the Tories at a time when they are more than 20 points behind in the polls, Jacob.
What you say about the effectiveness of Boris Johnson's campaign is absolutely spot on. I mean, he is extraordinarily charismatic. People stop their cars to get out and talk to him and stop their vans and so on. Which they don't generally do for politicians. But the Prime Minister and the former Prime Minister are inevitably not the closest political allies. Just look at the circumstances of the summer.
Yes. And how about you, though? Do you think actually this government is falling apart and you're better off out of it? Maybe you don't want to re-enter the fray because there is the kind of stench of decline about this government.
Oh, no. Look, I'm a loyal Conservative. I want the Conservative Party to do well. I want Rishi Sunak to do well. I'm supporting him as leader of the party. I don't think changing leader is a sensible thing to do. I think changing leader last year did us nothing but damage. So, no, he has my support. I want him to succeed. And the Tory party has recovered from worse positions than this in the past. Just remember where we were in May 2019, when we had the worst election result in our history and went on to win a majority of 80.
Well, I'm sure there are more bad election results to come in May. But on that subject, you say that he's the Prime Minister, but he's not the Tory members' Prime Minister, is he? We heard from Jake Berry earlier in the week suggesting that the membership should have been given a confirmatory vote. Presumably, as very much the party man, you would agree with that?
I don't see the point in a confirmatory vote. I don't see where that gets you, that if there's only one candidate, it's a bit North Korean if you then have a vote. What I'm in favour of is party members maintaining their right to elect the leader of the Conservative Party. I think that's fundamentally important. I think it's democratic. It's why people join the Conservative Party. And I think those who want to take it purely to MPs ignore the history of last year. The problem last year wasn't caused by the members of the party and the country at large. It was caused by members of Parliament.
But the trouble is that the Tory membership don't really want Rishi Sunak. They wanted Liz Truss, regardless of how that ended up. They also don't like some of these policies. Presumably you don't like them either. The idea that Jeremy Hunt appears in the week talking about the economy and then rules out tax cuts. You must be tearing your hair out as a Conservative at the mere notion of 6% further on corporation tax, for instance. You can't back up any of these governmental decisions because you don't agree with them, Jacob. Let's be honest.
Well, I'm not a great one for tearing hair out, really, but your point is a perfectly reasonable one. I think that the increase in corporation tax may well lead to lower rates of revenue coming in, that the decrease in corporation tax led to a very significant increase in corporation tax revenues. I think they went up by 50%. So I think you need to look at taxation sensibly and see where the Laffer curve works and where it doesn't. There seems to be quite good evidence that it works in terms of corporation tax. And bear in mind, when George Osborne cut corporation tax, he had done a dynamic assessment of the effect it would have, which is very unusual for the Treasury. The Treasury usually does it on a static basis. And that's why he came to the conclusion that cutting the tax would actually benefit the revenue. So I've said many times
that I
think that...
Well, Jeremy Hunt's making a mistake then, because he's the one who said the only tax cut that the public needs right now is a cut to inflation. It sounds to me like you're saying that he should axe this decision to add 6% to corporation tax in the March budget.
I think cutting corporation tax would make the public finances and the economy stronger rather than weaker. As a general rule, however, I'm not in favour of unfunded tax cuts. I think they need to go hand in glove with cutting government expenditure. The state is spending and taxing too much money, and it's not even delivering the services that people want. I think a lot of this is people working from home, and therefore services are not of the standard they should be, but that we need to get the size of the state under control and then have the tax burden that is necessary to afford that, rather than thinking that the state can get bigger and bigger and poor hard-pressed taxpayers can pay more and more because they can't.
OK, so a cut in spending might be needed. Now, finally, I'd like to ask you about your new GB News show. Jacob, what are you going to be doing? Who are you going to be speaking to? What's going to be the theme and the look of the show? Well,
I'm very excited to be doing it. I think GB News is such a fantastic outlet, supporter of freedom of speech, and close to its viewers and listeners. And I think that's important. I think what you're doing in Milton Keynes today and so on shows the rapport that GB News has with its viewers. And that's what I want to build on. So I want it to be a programme that people watching think is on their side, representing them, battling for the things that they believe in. And I hope to have a wide range of guests coming on. I hope that people will come on who disagree with me, because very often
Jacob,
conversations with people who
brilliant.
disagree with you are more fun than those who agree.
Thank you very much, Jacob. We look forward to the new show. Coming up, Gerard Lyons, Julie Bindel and the People's Panel after this.
He's the king of breakfast TV, and he's back.
Eamon Holmes back on the TV
Surprised
with me this morning.
Even remember my name.
I know, it's been 4 months. You have holy water by your bed?
Oh yes,
good.
already to bless.
Oh, Eamon. Oh.
Why do you not believe anything I say?
Eamon Holmes back on GB News Breakfast at 6 a.m.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions are, those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
This year on GB News, we've got brand new members in the family.
Join us. Across the entire United Kingdom, we cover the issues that matter to you.
GB News will always stay honest, balanced and fair. We want to hear whatever is on your mind.
And we don't talk down to you.
The establishment had their chance.
Now we're here to represent you.
Britain's watching.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway,
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pierce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion, and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, there's still a lot more to come today on the Camilla Tominey Show. I'm going to be speaking shortly to Dr. Gerard Lyons, Boris Johnson's former economics advisor, on the state of the economy and Jeremy Hunt's speech in the week. I'm also going to be speaking to leading feminist Julie Bindel a bit later in the show about the stories surrounding this transgender inmate. But first, here's the news headlines with Bethany Elsey.
Camilla, thank you. Good morning. It's 1 minute past 10. I'm Bethany Elsey in the GB newsroom. Nadeem Zahawi has been sacked from the government after an ethics inquiry found a serious breach of the ministerial code. The former Tory party chair has come under increasing pressure over his tax affairs after admitting he paid a penalty to HMRC for an error linked to his shares in the polling company YouGov. Following an inquiry by the independent ethics advisor, Sir Laurie Magnus, it's been confirmed it was his lack of reasonable care that's led to his removal from government. Rishi Sunak said he must keep his pledge to have integrity, professionalism and accountability at every level. Jacob Rees-Mogg says if a story dominates politics for so long, the minister must go.
The report seems to show that he made some technical errors with his declarations under the ministerial code, and the Prime Minister has decided that they were serious enough to fire him. So I feel sorry for Nadeem Zahawi, but I think that after it dominating the headlines for a week, the rule of politics is that if you do that, it's very hard to remain in office.
The Housing Secretary has admitted that faulty government guidance allowed the Grenfell Tower tragedy to happen. Michael Gove told the Sunday Times the government didn't police the whole system of building safety effectively enough. Tomorrow, Mr Gove will announce a 6-week deadline for developers to sign a contract to fix their unsafe towers or be banned from building new homes. The fire at the residential tower block in West London in 2017 killed 72 people. Boris Johnson was reportedly told to stop asking Richard Sharp for advice about his personal financial matters just 2 weeks before he was announced as the new chair of the BBC. According to the Sunday Times, Mr Johnson, who was the Prime Minister at the time, was warned by officials to stop discussions in December 2020. The former banker is facing calls to resign after it emerged he introduced the Prime Minister to a guarantor for a loan. And the government will publish an urgent emergency care plan tomorrow to try and tackle pressure on the NHS. It comes as the Health Department have announced plans to build virtual beds, caring for tens of thousands of elderly and vulnerable people at home. It's part of a strategy by the Health Department to shift some NHS care away from hospitals. The Health Secretary admitted there was no quick fix to the service, but this immediate action would reduce waiting times. You're up to date on TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Now it's back to Camilla.
Well, welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show, as well as Gerard Lyons, who I'm going to speak to in just a moment, and the feminist Julie Bindel. We've got a right old Brexit ding-dong to come in the generation gap. We've got a former UKIP boomer versus a Romaniac millennial, so that should be interesting. We're also going to get back to the People's Panel in Milton Keynes. But Dr. Gerard Lyons joins me. Thank you very much. You're a strategic partner, I believe, and shareholder with Net Wealth these days, a leading voice on economic matters. Before I bring you in, Gerard, let's just see what Jeremy Hunt said earlier this week about tax cuts. He appeared to rule them out when he gave his speech at Bloomberg. Let's just hear his words.
The biggest and quickest tax cut that the Prime Minister and I can deliver for families up and down the country is to halve inflation. That is eating away at people's pay packets, their spending power. It's pushing up the price of the weekly shop. And that is something we can deliver quickly and will help everyone. We are committed, as I made very clear, to a low tax economy. And the difference between Conservatives and Labour is that we cut taxes when we can, they never do. And that's because we recognise that a low tax economy is one of the vital ingredients for dynamism, entrepreneurialism, to encourage people to take risks, and that's why we want to do it when the time is right.
So that was Jeremy Hunt speaking on Friday at Bloomberg HQ, ruling out tax cuts, even though the Tory membership, Tory voters and the wider electorate, having seen this squeeze on their finances, are desperate for taxes to be cut. What's your reaction to it, Gerard? Are they right to want taxes to be cut, and is the Chancellor wrong?
Well, good morning. It's great to be on the show. Well, in terms of tax cuts, it's amazing how in this debate taxes always come centre stage, whereas the reality is that taxes have to be seen in the context of the overall economy, and it depends on economic condition. For instance, last autumn, the Chancellor raised taxes. It's like putting the foot on the brake in the car. Now there's the calls for him to cut taxes by many people. That's like putting the foot on the accelerator. But whether you put the foot on the brake or the accelerator depends on overall conditions. I would agree, as indeed the Chancellor did, with the idea that taxes do need to come down, but it's about what you do at the moment. The room for manoeuvre is probably limited. So coming back to your question, is it the thing that he should be doing immediately? Probably not. But the point is that taxes do need to start to be reduced. But when we talk about the economy, taxes are just one lever. Taxes need to be seen within the context of overall economic conditions. So coming back to your question, as I say, I wouldn't agree with the idea that taxes need to go up. Taxes are already very high. Whether this is the time to cut taxes, I think it's more a case that you need to stabilise the economy. But as he also touched on, it's about reducing inflation as well.
Can we talk about corporation tax? Because Jacob Rees-Mogg has just come on and he's questioning whether that is the tax to put up come March when he gives the budget. I mean, I know there's a huge debate about this and people talk about the Laffer curve, and when corporation tax was cut, the receipts seemed to go up. Also, in this post-Brexit environment, we're meant to be being more competitive against the likes of Germany and France that are famed for their high corporation tax rates. Is it a mistake shaving another 6% off already fragile post-COVID profits for business?
OK. Last autumn, there was pressure to raise taxes. 2 tax increases that I didn't think were justified with national insurance. The market and economists agreed. The other tax increase that is now about to be implemented is corporation tax going up. Now, the challenge with it is this. When corporation tax was reduced from 25 to 19%, the tax base was widened.
Yes.
Now the corporation tax rate is going up on that wider tax base. So it's hitting business costs, business competitiveness very hard. What many are calling for instance, the Confederation of British Industry, and I would agree with them, is that, OK, if you're putting corporation tax up, that's not great, but don't take away all the other allowances as well. And that's also happening and is not receiving enough attention. So if you put the corporation tax rate up, and the Chancellor would say he has to, I would disagree. What you then should argue for, in my view, is to actually make sure the allowances that were there before remain in place, the so-called super deductor, to encourage firms to invest. Now, the important thing is that we do need to look at taxes in the context of the economy overall. The way I would describe the economy at the moment is the good, the bad and the uncertain.
Right.
The good is that inflation, although it's very high, is set to come down sharply this year, and that will help the economy in the second half of the year. The bad is that the economy is currently very fragile, very weak, very vulnerable, and is not going to have much growth, if any at all, in the first half of the year. The uncertain is where inflation comes down to. Another uncertainty is what the Bank of England does, and they meet this week to decide on interest rates.
What should they do?
My view is they should leave rates unchanged. If interest rates are 3.5%. The economy is already slowing or weak. Inflation has peaked and is set to fall. Previous rate hikes are set to feed through, and the Bank of England is already going to be tightening anyway through reversing quantitative easing, that is, taking money, liquidity out of the economy. But because the Bank of England got it so wrong 2 years ago, they feel that they need to prove their toughness. So the likelihood is that they will probably still raise rates. Interest rates are 3.5%. I think they should stay there, pause there, plateau there, not peak there. But the bank might well raise rates this week to 3.75% or to 4%. So unfortunately, if you're borrowing, if you're leveraged, interest rates are going to go higher. But the point is that the economy faces many challenges at the moment. And coming back to your broader question about tax cuts, that's part of the issue. But my personal view is that while I favoured the idea of lower taxes, I don't think that's the centre stage issue at the moment. And I heard the Chancellor speak on Friday afternoon as well. He was speaking at an event I was attending, the Anglo-British-French event. And he was talking there about all the E's, employment, enterprise, everywhere. The thing is, it was more a statement of intent.
Yeah.
What we're talking about here is that actions are needed. And I would say that this is probably the best way to view this, is the run-up to the budget in mid-March. And we do need to see actions. A plan for growth is really necessary.
Some substance over perhaps some of the sound bites. You just mentioned the Bank of England there. I mean, there are mixed views on this. I know you also provided some economic advice to Liz Truss while she was briefly Prime Minister. I mean, who really shafted homeowners when it came to interest rates? Was it Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey, or was it Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng?
OK, well, I only saw her twice before she became Prime Minister.
And I know you warned against unfunded tax cuts.
Yeah, once she went into Downing Street, unfortunately, I didn't see her again. The markets were then...
She could have done with seeing you probably, Gerard.
Yeah, but in answer to your question is a very valid point. The markets were in a very febrile state then. And part of the reason the markets were in a very febrile state then, back in the autumn, was because they were very worried about inflation. And part of the blame there does, coming back to your question, lie with the Bank of England. The Chancellor then and the Prime Minister then should have been mindful of that and should have taken on board what the markets are saying. And it comes back to Jeremy Hunt at the beginning. If you look at who does he need to keep on side, there's naturally the general public, there's business, hence you asked about corporation tax, and there's also the financial markets. I think he still is, I won't say overly worrying about the financial markets. Markets are now very stable, but we need to move on from that. You could argue that, OK, he's established his credibility in the eyes of the market. What we now need to see in the next few weeks in the run-up to the budget is more real skin on the bone about a plan for growth, and that will address the concerns of the general public and business community.
I just need to break in just for a second, Gerard. Sorry, just because obviously we're on a live news programme. There's some breaking news from Nazim Zahawi. He's written a letter to the Prime Minister where he's thanked him for his kind words. I arrived in this country fearing persecution and speaking no English. He said that he made his business here, he made his life here. I am concerned about the conduct from some of the Fourth Estate in recent weeks. In a week when the Member of Parliament was physically assaulted, I failed to see how one headline on this issue, the news titans, reflect legitimate scrutiny in public officials. I'm sorry to my family the toll this has taken on them. A very personal letter from Nazim Zahawi in response to having been sacked this morning by the Prime Minister. Did you ever had any dealings with Nazim Zahawi?
Oh, well, I met him when he was Chancellor.
Yes.
So I indeed meet all the Chancellors, but I didn't really have any dealings with him.
Do you think on this issue, sometimes it's interesting you say about Jeremy Hunt, you know, in business, do politicians always understand economics adequately? I say that because we've got a businessman here who's obviously made multi-million pounds, and yet the politics of what's happened with his tax affairs has been deeply damaging, so damaging it's cost him his job. We had Jeremy Hunt when he gave his previous autumn statement describing, for instance, dividends received by company bosses as unearned income. That suggests to me that sometimes politicians can be a little bit economically illiterate. Is that a fair comment?
Well, it would be wrong to generalise completely, but I think you're right about the need to really understand not only the policies, but also how they implement people and firms. But often it's about the explanation and the execution of the issues of the policies. But in terms of whoever they are, the real issue is this. Coming back from the individual, since 2008, the UK economy has become a low-growth economy. The event I was at on Thursday, Friday and Saturday, we tend to think here in the UK all these issues are just us. The French I was speaking to were saying how the French economy is in deep trouble. In fact, people were saying coming from Paris to London is like coming from a third world city to a first world city. We tend to think everything is terrible here. The real unfortunate issue is this, that in Western Europe, the major economies are in the same boat. That doesn't make it easy for whoever is in power here in the UK at the moment. But we have to address up to these issues, and therefore we can't solve it overnight. That's the challenge.
It's interesting there isn't much government pushback, for instance, against the likes of Mark Carney, former Bank of England governor, who is often quite willing to stand up and start criticising the UK, I notice, in the press.
Yeah.
And he says that the UK is in the most difficult position of the major economies, full stop. You're saying that, no, the picture isn't good across Europe.
Yeah, well, Mark Carney often talks about this in the context of Brexit. The reality is that the issues challenging the UK economy predate Brexit, and their solution is not going to be solved by going back, for instance, into the EU. Now, some people say that Brexit has made them worse. I would disagree. Certainly the political crisis from 2016 to 2019 didn't help and has framed the debate. But at the same time, the government really needs to follow through. Brexit itself was an event. how we address it in terms of economic and financial terms is a process. So it's not just leaving, it's what you do. So coming back to Mark Carney's question, it's a challenge facing not just the Western world, but Western Europe in particular. What we see, the markets at the moment are more optimistic about the global economy. That's partly because America's likely to have a soft landing. China is now opening up. When you actually look at the world economy, the Western Europe at the moment, when we joined the EU, for instance, back in 1973, it accounted for 26% of the world economy. Now, Western Europe, the major economies, are about 20% of the world economy. Pretty important still.
Yes.
But in 25 years' time, Western Europe, whether you agree with the EU or not, is going to be about 10% of the world economy. India is going to be a bigger economy. That's the reality where we are. And coming back to Carney's point, the challenge is that in Western Europe, especially with ageing populations, we are not achieving the economic growth that we need to achieve. That's why we need to have sensible growth policies. Taxes are part of this, but we shouldn't always make tax the most important issue. Fundamental issues, we need to be investing more. Hence your question, though, about corporation tax is important. Businesses need to be encouraged to invest. They need to be investing and keeping jobs. And of course, the general public need to see inflation being brought down by a Bank of England that gets on top of the problem.
That's two people this morning who have basically said, scrap the corporation tax rise. Thank you very much for that. Dr. Gerard Lyons, thanks for joining me this morning.
Pleasure.
Well, let's go back to our People's Panel now. Paul Hawkins is in Milton Keynes. I'm very intrigued to know, Paul, what people there make of Jacob Rees-Mogg saying he feels sorry for Nadeem Zahawi.
Yeah, I was just wondering that myself, Camilla. Let's find out, shall we? Let's speak to Steph first of all. Steph, we'll go through this letter that's just come out from Nadeem Zahawi in just a moment, especially the penultimate paragraph. But first of all, do you agree with Jacob Rees-Mogg? Do you feel sorry for Nadeem Zahawi?
No, well, I have mixed feelings, actually. I think all politicians should make sure their house is in order and be very clear that they're above any criticism. But also, I do think that we need to start concentrating on the politics and not the individuals. We need to focus on getting the jobs done and it not be a personality, cult anymore. We really need to get on with the job and make the economy, right.
Yeah. Peter, it was just it was, as Jacob Rees-Mogg pointed out, it was a technical error, and he feels very sorry for the former Chancellor.
Technical error, I don't agree with. Essentially, people that earn a lot of money pay a lot of tax, and they use independent tax advisors, financial advisors, to try and avoid the tax burden. And when you're talking about paying millions of pounds in tax, of course, people will look at these, whether it's legal or illegal, they get advice, and unfortunately he's been caught out. He's obviously had a business, he's sheltered tax in, I believe, Gibraltar. It used to be places like Isle of Man, Guernsey, Luxembourg, and so forth. But that all got changed and people had to declare these things. So he's not made a mistake. He's probably been advised to do this, and hopefully you'll get away with it.
He called it an innocent error.
There's no such thing as an innocent error when you're dealing with such large sums of money. So it's unfortunate. He's been caught out. Inland Revenue's picked up on it. He's been fined. He's paid the fine. But let's not get away from the fact that he's still got things to do, and he did a good job in the government. So why penalise him beyond what he's already paid in a fine?
Yeah, Peter, thank you. Let's get the final word from Chris. Chris, do you feel sorry for Nadeem Zahawi? And also, this letter from Nadeem Zahawi to the Prime Minister saying that, talking about the conduct from some on the Fourth Estate in recent weeks, he's referring to the media. And also, when a member of Parliament was physically assaulted, he fails to see how one headline on the issue reflects legitimate scrutiny of his tax affairs.
What I would say is, people in that position, they know that they're subject to scrutiny more than probably anyone else in the country. If subsequently he's vindicated in time, then obviously people will have to reflect on that. The trouble is with this, of course, is that when I came here today, the idea was to discuss the hot topics of the day, those topics that are affecting the nation. Talking about energy, fuel crisis, cost of living, small boats, Northern Ireland and Brexit. those things have been completely wiped off the table, and we're talking about a man's tax affairs. As important as it is, this is not the main priority for people in the United Kingdom.
All right, thanks very much, Chris, Steph and Peter. So that's what the People's Panel's saying in Milton Keynes at the moment. Back to you, Camilla.
Thank you very much for that, Paul. You see, it's your and my fault. It's the Fourth Estate that have done this. I mean, honestly, a Cabinet Minister has to pay a £1.3 million penalty to HMRC, and it's the media's fault. I agree if there's invective or unfair reporting, but come on, let's get this into perspective. Let's just read a couple of your emails now. Don't forget you can give us your views at gbviews@gbnews.uk. Desmond says, never mind Zahawi, Sunak should go as well. Not a ringing endorsement of the Prime Minister's action on this. Sean says, the residents in Milton Keynes are right. Zahawi should have resigned sooner, before he was sacked. Paying his £5 million back is after the fact. Well, I think I can't disagree with that, I must be honest. If you want to apply to next week's People's Panel, don't forget you can apply at gbnews.uk/panel. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by leading feminist Julie Bindel. It's been a big week for feminism, and indeed this transgender row continues to fill the newspapers and the column inches after Adam Graham and the decision at the last minute for Nicola Sturgeon not to put him in a women's prison after all, considering he's a convicted rapist. Now, the latest on this is Nicola Sturgeon now telling the Scotsman some gender reform critics using women's rights are hiding bigotry. She said that some of these people, yourself included, Julie, I imagine, you're cloaking yourself in women's rights to hide your bigotry. You're not just bigoted, by the way, you may also be a transphobe. Quite an extraordinary allegation to level against a lesbian, but we'll come on to that in a moment. And you might be a racist.
That's right, and we are bigots and Nazis all of a sudden, after, in my case, and the case of many other feminists that I work with on this issue, after more than 4 decades of campaigning to end male violence against women and girls, rape, domestic violence, the murder of women and girls, forced marriage, you name it, we've campaigned against it. We are only involved in this struggle, in this war, that we didn't want to start because we don't want men in single-sex spaces because they pose a danger. Now, when I say men, I include those men that identify as transgender. They are still men. They still perpetrate sex crimes and other crimes against women and girls, as do non-trans-identified men. And so that's why we have legislation and policy which says we can have our own hospital wards, prison wings, refuges, changing rooms, sports facilities. It's not because we ever said all men are rapists, it's because we recognised through credible research all over the world that enough men, a large enough minority of men, do perpetrate these crimes against women and girls. Therefore, we need our own spaces. So this is not about keeping trans women out of women's prisons and the like. It's about keeping men out of women's prisons, and that should include male prison officers. And when you talk about that, obviously the transgender community will say, look, this guy, Adam Graham, he identifies as Isla Bryson. He has got the right to do that. Obviously, if he was up in Scotland, he would be able to do that with this new gender recognition bill. Thanks to Sturgeon, he'd be able to just simply declare that because he's over 16. He doesn't need any medical intervention, no medical confirmation at all. He's able to do that. We now read, and I think you've also looked into this, Julie, that there's another criminal, somebody who has assaulted a 13-year-old girl in the same situation as Adam Graham. What's your response to that case? What kind of world do we live in where convicted rapists and sex offenders are being placed on the female estate when we know that the vast majority of those women in prison are highly vulnerable, whatever their crimes, and most have ended up in prison as a direct or indirect result of men's violence in childhood through to adulthood? Now, I actually would say that there is no space, no place at all for any man, whether they're convicted sex offenders or not, in women's prisons and women-only spaces. And the idea that gender identity somehow trumps sex is nonsense. It's because of men's violence that we have single-sex exemptions, that we have a right to these spaces. And the vast majority of male sex offenders are not ever convicted. They're usually never even arrested. So why would it be safe to have any man in women's prisons? And as I say, I include male prison officers in that. Let's just clarify that point. Obviously, Adam Graham has undergone no surgery or anything.
and he is a sex offender.
Yes.
What about a transgender woman who had undergone alignment surgery, who had got a certificate, who hadn't necessarily committed any crimes against women? Maybe they were in for fraud or something that was a non-violent offence. How would you feel about that person being placed in a women's prison?
In exactly the same way as I would about a man who had not committed any crime, who seems like a really nice chap, who decides that he's going to get changed next to a 14, 15-year-old girl in a sports facility. It's not because we say that they are rapists or they are sex offenders. It's because we recognise that enough of that minority of men that are pose a danger to women and girls. But also, we have to look at the fear that women experience when we see a man who shouldn't be there in a space that's supposed to be designated single sex because of our vulnerability. Hospital wards, prisons and the like.
But does post-op make a difference?
No, not at all. I think that it's obviously, it just adds, fuel to the fire when we're talking about some bloke walking around with his penis visible through his clothing, or even, in the case of Karen White, another trans-identified male, his actual penis visible per se on a prison wing. Of course it does. It instills even more fear in women. But men, including those that identify as transgender, commit acts of sexual violence. Every single piece of research, including our government's research, has shown to the same extent, in the same pattern as do men that don't involve, that have not undergone any form of gender reassignment, including those that socially transition. And I think it's an absolute obscenity that we put the so-called rights of men who just identify as women, when we know they're not. Every single person listening to this knows they're not women, above the rights and the well-being of women who are already vulnerable enough.
But this is how the dialogue has changed, hasn't it? And I think this is a question that Nicola Sturgeon and some of her supporters have sort of failed to answer. Who is it who decides, ultimately, the identity of any given person? Because there will be trans people watching this who consider you a TERF, who consider you a bigot, as Sturgeon has described you, and J.K. Rowling and others, who say, look, if this man identifies as a woman, then you are eroding his human rights, you're eroding his right to be seen equally to womankind.
I don't care. The trans-identified men already have rights. They have men's rights. I do not care if they're offended, and I also don't care if any man wishes to use a female name, wear a skirt and claim that he is a woman. Let him, fill your boots. But he's not. And we know, all women know, that the only reason why we have single-sex spaces and sex-based rights in law and policy is because of men's violence. If men stop raping and killing us, if men stop beating us in relationships, stop being a danger, stop posing a danger, we won't care. It doesn't matter. Until that day, then we have to have our own facilities in order to protect the most vulnerable of us from men's violence.
What's your analysis of why Nicola Sturgeon is pushing this so hard? Because we obviously associate her with the independence campaign. This is now proving a massive distraction. There's some rhetoric in the newspapers this morning about it might actually be the end of her political tenure.
I hope so. I hope so. I think Nicola Sturgeon is a disgrace. I think this is all about political expediency. She is looking at getting plaudits. She wants to be seen as the kind, exclusive person. She wants to be praised by all of those that don't give a damn about women's rights, because, of course, that's really deeply unfashionable. To be a feminist and say men do commit acts of violence and this is wrong is a deeply unattractive and unpopular thing to say. It gets their hackles rising, and I've known this for over 40 years of feminism. Nicola Sturgeon is anything but a feminist. She's a betrayer of women, she's a disgrace, and I do hope that this ends her political career and that it serves a warning to all the other posturers that come after her.
Well, let's talk about other political posturing, because my analysis of you would be that you have always been on the left, and yet the left seems to have been found wanting on this issue. We saw the behaviour towards Rosie Duffield in the House of Commons last week. We've then got this bizarre situation where the likes of Keir Starmer and others can't seem to define whether a woman can or can't have a penis, whether a woman does or doesn't have a cervix. I mean, as a lefty, if I may call you that, Julie, what's your analysis of how the left are handling this issue?
Well, I do think that we have to separate the Labour Party and its current administration from the left in general. You know, the left does not belong to those misogynistic men who claim that they speak for the left, and the right has let women down drastically and horrendously over the years with taking money away from refugees, from failing to recognise that women have vulnerabilities when it comes to male violence, attacking single mothers, taking away benefits that leave women extremely vulnerable. So the right is no friend to women. The left needs a kick right up their backside. And Rosie Duffield, who's a dear friend of mine, who was a darling of the Labour Party, rightly so, because she spoke publicly about her own domestic abuse situation and standing up to that abuse. She has been treated, I would say, sadistically. And I think that anyone, despite your views on this issue, despite whether you sit on the left or the right, should speak out in support of Rosie, because it's the way that she has been treated that has deterred other women on the left that should know better, that should be speaking out fully and publicly in support of Rosie and in support of women's rights.
Julie Bindel, thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
Well, coming up, we've got a right Brexit ding-dong to come in our generation gap. We're also going to be speaking to Stephen Nallen, who's a co-writer and voice of Spitting Image. All that's after the news headlines with Bethany Elsey.
Camilla, thank you. Good morning. It's 10:30. I'm Bethany Elsey in the GB newsroom. Nadeem Zahawi has been sacked from the government after an ethics inquiry found a serious breach of the ministerial code. The former Tory party chair faced questions over his tax affairs after admitting he paid a penalty to HMRC for an error linked to his shares in the polling company YouGov. In a letter, Mr Zahawi assured the Prime Minister he'll continue to support the government from the backbenches in the coming years. The Housing Secretary has admitted that faulty government guidance allowed the Grenfell Tower tragedy to happen. Michael Gove says the whole system of building safety wasn't policed effectively enough. He's expected to announce a 6-week deadline for developers tomorrow, forcing them to sign a contract to either fix their unsafe homes or be banned from building new ones. The fire at the residential tower block in West London in 2017 killed 72 people. The government will publish an urgent emergency care plan tomorrow to try and tackle pressures on the NHS. It comes as the Health Department have announced plans to build virtual beds, caring for tens of thousands of elderly and vulnerable people at home. The Health Secretary admitted there was no quick fix, but this immediate action would reduce wait times. You're up to date on TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Camilla will be back with you in just a moment.
He's the king of breakfast TV, and he's back.
Eamon Holmes, back on the TV with me this morning.
Even remember my name.
I know, it's been 4 months. You have holy water by your bed?
Oh, yes.
Oh,
already to bless.
Yeah. Oh, Eamon. Oh.
Why do you not believe anything I say?
Eamon Holmes back on GB News Breakfast at 6 a.m.
Every weekend, it's Mark Dolan Tonight. Bigger and better, starting at 8 p.m. Friday and Saturday.
Can't be too safe. Bring it on. Has there ever been a more innuendo feature?
And Sundays, we're on at 9.
It's ridiculous.
Just get on with it. Maybe you should get a proper job.
Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Click that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
The guy went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions.
I have no time for cultural totalitarianism.
We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate, with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Crikey Moses, it's been a busy morning in Westminster. I just want to bring you up to speed with exactly what's happened if you're just joining me. So we had two letters this morning that were released by the government. First of all, we had the person who's conducted the independent investigation into Nadeem Zahawi's tax affairs, Sir Laurie Magnus. He wrote to the Prime Minister basically saying that the party chairman had broken the ministerial code. I've got Number 10's letter in front of me now. No, I don't. I have Laurie Magnus's, but basically the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, then wrote to Nadeem Zahawi and said, look, you've clearly broken the ministerial code and I'm sacking you. So all of this talk about will he resign or not, in the end, his hand has very massively been forced by the Prime Minister himself. We have just had, in the last 20 or so minutes, Nadeem Zahawi's response to having been sacked. And he's written a pretty emotional letter where he's talking about the fourth estate, the media and some of our coverage of this. And I think there was one headline he's taken exception to, sort of suggesting that the noose was around his neck, and said that this was not conducive to his own family's feelings of safety and security. We also heard earlier in the show Jacob Rees-Mogg, former cabinet colleague of Mr Zahawi's, saying that he felt sorry for the cabinet minister. You don't seem to be feeling too sorry for him. We've heard from our People's panel in Milton Keynes who don't have that much sympathy. Let me just read a couple more of your emails this morning. Aidan says, typical of politicians today, greed and all the pontificating about tightening our belts, yet he and others are swindling our tax system, which helps fund our country. It's no small amount. It's totally disgusting. John says, it amazes me that MPs like Zahawi can be so irresponsible and careless in the handling of their affairs. Do they know that they can never get away with such manoeuvres? A disrespect for political integrity is a death sentence. And Barry says, I fail to understand, and I'm sure the rest of my country will feel the same, why these educated men who run the country think they can cover up and carry on as normal. Now, let me just say one thing for myself and Nadeem Zahawi, because I do know him personally. I've had to work with him on various different things in the course of my journalistic time. I think he's made a grave error, and it's clear that he's broken the ministerial code. On a personal level, he's always been very charming, very polite, and a decent guy. It's obviously difficult because his political career and reputation is now in tatters, and one wishes him well to rebuild. But I think the Prime Minister's taken that affirmative action, and that has been the breaking news story of the hour. Now, we want to make news with my next guests. UKIP's Henry Bolton and journalist and commentator Benjamin Butterworth are joining me now for a right Brexit debate, because on Tuesday, as both of you gentlemen will well know, it's the 3rd anniversary of our exit from the EU. And so I suppose the killer question for the generational debate today, you're a millennial, Ben, right?
I am.
And I think you might be a boomer, Henry, am I correct?
1963.
1963. So I'm going to put it to you, gentlemen, I'd like you to debate this against each other. Brexit has been a disaster, Henry, or a success?
Now, I'm speaking for myself now. This is my opinion. Brexit was never in itself ever going to deliver anything apart from the UK's independence in law, government and public administration. And the value of that was that actually then accountability would return to Westminster. Before Brexit, before the referendum, we had this situation where the public wasn't ever quite sure whether things they weren't happy about were the fault of Brussels or the fault of Westminster.
So it's a success of democracy, but
correct.
People aren't reaping the benefits,
well, in democratic terms, we already are. You've just been talking about Zahawi, and the fact is that now everybody is going to, not to Brussels, and nobody's blaming the European Union for everything. They're going to Westminster and asking why our politicians aren't delivering. And that's the element, the crucial element. Now, all of the other elements of it, are we going to be better off or worse off? There's a lot of disinformation out there. What I would say to people is now it is down to the British politicians and the British public to demand quality. We have a real lack of leadership.
It's been 3 years, though, Henry. Let me bring Ben here. It's been 3 years.
Yes, and we've had a massive failure of political leadership in this country. No vision, no structure, no plan, no strategy.
But, I mean, so we've had, what, 3 prime ministers in that time, and the reason they haven't been able to deliver is because there never was a plan. Because you had politicians like yourself and UKIP, you had the Tories, you had this, ragtag of different people making all sorts of different claims, none of which were stitched together. And the reason that we're in a political crisis and an economic crisis, one that comparable countries are not in so deeply with their economies, the reason we're in that situation is because it was a flawed argument from the first place. I think the last time I was in here was when I was working on the Remain campaign.
The problem here, Ben, is that between the majority of people who voted Leave, were perfectly well aware of the government's position and the risk associated with leaving the European Union. David Cameron's administration sent a booklet to every household in the country, basically recommending that we voted to remain in the European Union. Now, if people didn't read that booklet, fine. But those people who did were well aware of the economic element of change. If you change something...
Hang on, Henry, I'm going to get there, because
let me finish.
Hang on, let's bring Ben in.
You can't try and say that they were aware of the risks and then try and pretend that it's been a success, because so much of what was said would go wrong.
Ben, you didn't let me finish. OK, that was all based on economic change. When you change from one thing to another, there is disruption. Disruption affects the economy. There was inevitably, and if you go back and look at my tweets, my blog posts and so on, you will see me saying that was going to happen. I knew it was going to happen. Every right-minded person who could think for themselves knew or knows that if you change from one system to another system, then you have a certain amount of disruption. The economy doesn't like...
There we have it. No, you've admitted failure of Brexit yourself.
Let me finish.
Let's bring Ben in.
Let me finish, because my point is...
Your point,
my point is... One more sentence, and my point will be made. That is because certain people are saying that Brexit has to be based, it's the success of it, or the judgment, on the economic outcome now. And that is not... I'm saying that the purpose of Brexit was to deliver independence in law, government and public administration so that our own politicians, accountable to the British people, could actually make decisions about how we best exploit opportunities for the United Kingdom.
Benjamin.
I mean, you have basically admitted it, Henry. You have said that Brexit has failed. No, and that's because Brexit... You say right now that it's not delivering and that it's not working.
No, I didn't say that. The Remainers always put those sort of words in my mouth.
Well, it's what you just said.
No, I didn't say any of those words.
You're saying that it's being judged purely on economics now.
Yes,
and
what needs to happen...
Hang on, we've undone 40-plus years of EU laws and regulations, and we've got to give it more time. We've had a pandemic, we've had a war in Ukraine, we've got inflation sky high. You've got to give it more time to see whether it is going to be a success.
I mean, as a young person, you think about the 6 years. I'm 30, so it slightly alarms me, but I have plenty of friends now that weren't even old enough to vote when that referendum happened, and their economic chances, their cost of living, so many factors, their opportunities, like when they were at university, to go to other universities around the world on exchange programs. So many of those things are diminished because of Brexit.
That's simply not true.
And you have a generation that has access to a smaller world than the one that you would have had.
Let Ben finish his point, because you make a point about, it's kind of the Brexit thing. It was boomers versus younger people. Younger people weren't as in support of it, Ben, were they?
I think it was something like 70 or 80% of people under 35 voted Remain. Meanwhile, obviously, it goes to the reverse once you get to pensioners. And the truth is that you talk about these obviously complicating factors, like the pandemic and like the war in Ukraine, but the other countries in the G7 have had those same factors, and yet we're the only one who has not yet returned our economy to the size of 2019. With the exception of Russia in the G20, we have the smallest growth projection.
Although we heard from an economist this morning, Gerard Lyons was on, saying that France and Germany are also in a bit of a pickle.
Correct. You say the G7. Let's talk about the European Union. OK? Inflation and interest rates in the UK are right in the middle of the Eurozone. OK? You can't tell me that Brexit is the reason why inflation and interest rates in the Eurozone have gone up. Now, you talk about the reduction in students being able to... their opportunities to study abroad.
The Erasmus scheme.
The Turing scheme British funded, British government policy, British government scheme has now, in 2022-23, has placed nearly 39,000 British students in 150 different locations around the world, working closely with the Commonwealth Universities Association. Now, that's a fact of it. And the other thing that I would say is that you are...
Briefly, Henry.
In terms of the generation gap, I was never anti-European or being part of the European Union until I went to work there. Now, life brings you certain experience and you can compare things.
But
I can
Ben's
compare
saying
things
he might not get the experience of working in Europe because of what's
he's got
happened.
that experience.
Ben,
Or he's got that opportunity.
Let's bring him in.
We now don't have freedom of movement. And if you look at the kind of serious fundamental problems that our economy has, the central one is that we have a lack of workers. You know, in this country at the moment, a fifth of people are claiming a pension. There are more people living off pensions than coming through the school system, more over 65 than under 16. We have 1.6 million vacancies in this country. That is more than the number of people seeking work. And so when we have a negative migration number from the EU, as we did in last year, what you have there is a lot of skilled workers from developed countries on our doorstep who don't want to bring their talent and their skills and their tax money to this country. And that is a consequence of Brexit. And that is a fundamental problem we have in our
It's
economy.
not a fundamental problem at all. And
we don't have enough workers.
You can go and work in Brussels. OK, I worked in Brussels.
I don't want to. It's quite a boring city, to be fair.
I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. But the thing is, if you have a job, you can go there. And when we were still in the European Union, and I worked for the European Commission, I went to Brussels, and you know what? You've got to do all the documentation, you've got to register everything.
Point, Henry.
My point is that immigration is not something that I'm opposed to, but it has to be properly managed, and we should be selective about the people that we let in.
You can't say the immigration policy's gone well since Brexit.
Well, we desperately need more immigrants. It's what the CBI says, it's what the Office for Budget Responsibility says. And the truth is that the reason that we have the highest taxes that any person currently in work has been able to pay since the 1970s is because we don't have enough people able to pay tax. We desperately need more immigrants in this country.
I'm white flagging this now, gents. You've both had your say, and I've thoroughly enjoyed that from generation to generation. Has the gap been bridged? I think not. Coming up after this, I'm going to be speaking to a spitting image actor who I hope is going to do a few impressions for us after what's been a pretty heavy day in Westminster. Stay tuned for that.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway...
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pearce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion, and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Well, if you're just joining me, maybe you had a lie-in, had a late breakfast. Breaking news on the show this morning, Nadhim Zahawi has been sacked by the Prime Minister as Tory party chairman. I'll just read out the statement that has been released by Downing Street, the letter that Rishi has written to Nadhim. Following the completion of the independent advisor's investigation, the findings of which he has shared with us both, it is clear that there has been a serious breach of the ministerial code. As a result, I have informed you of my decision to remove you from your position in Her Majesty's government. In the last 30 minutes or so, we've had Nadhim Zahawi's reaction to that. He has blamed the media, the so-called Fourth Estate, for the negative publicity around the stories of his tax affairs. Let's just get a few of your reactions here. Don't forget the email address to write into is gbviews@gbnews.uk. Billy says, all MPs should just do one job, the job they have been elected to do by the public. These so-called other earnings and second jobs would not exist if they just did one job. And let's face it, they get paid well for that. Good point, well made by Billy. Sarah says, we should cut Zahawi some slack. He has made a mistake and was right to resign. Well, Sarah, he hasn't resigned. He's been sacked. But I think he should say as an MP, he delivered us the vaccines, a reference there to Mr Zahawi before he was Chancellor and indeed party chairman in the merry-go-round that has been the government in recent months. He was also the vaccines minister, although some might argue that credit should go to the vaccine czar, Kate Bingham. Now, let's have a little bit of fun at the end of the show, because it has been quite taxing. There's been breaking news. We've had people being sacked. We've had people blaming the Fourth Estate, which I think I'm a member of. Let's bring in now Stephen Nallen, who's a co-writer and voice of Spitting Image. Now, I say that, your original Spitting Image, Steve. Can I just say, I'm a bit biased because I grew up with the show. That was Spitting Image at its finest.
I would agree with you if you want to get the Prime Minister of that particular day. You get her in. Get her in. So, it's odd, you see, today, Sunday.
Yes. Just to say, before you start, Steve, we're talking about this because Spitting Image, after 40 years, is now in a stage show in Birmingham. It starts on February the 1st. So this satirical show that originally everyone looked at these puppets and thought, what on earth is all this about, has stood the test of time. It's outlasted many governments and it still resonates today. And you were obviously original member, I suppose. You've given us a great impression there of the Iron Lady, who I know was your specialist subject. But why has this show stood the test of time, do you think?
Well, in a way, putting Spitting Image on stage is going back to its origins, because its origins were really Punch and Judy.
Yes.
You know, people talk about Punch and Judy politics. Well, in a way, Spitting Image on television was the Punch and Judy show, and actually literal punches, because, you know, the puppets were always fighting each other. One thing about the puppets, because their facial expressions never changed, you could hit them as often as you liked, and it made no difference. But today is, you know, Sunday. We're live breaking news, and it just reminded me of a day when we were making Spitting Image, and we were in the studio making what we called topicals on a Sunday morning for the show that went out that night.
Yes.
And that particular Sunday morning, Jeffrey Archer resigned.
Blimey.
Because there was he's the big News of the World story about Jeffrey Archer. It's about 30 years ago. And we had to put a sketch in that show that night.
So you're behaving like newspapers in the sense that you had to be right on the story. Nothing could be old. If it's going out that night, you've got to get the stories of the day in.
I don't think we had the Jeffrey Archer puppet in the studios, but if I remember correctly, we basically had Mrs Thatcher coming into her cabinet room with a pair of gardening shears, threatening to chop off all those bits of men that cause trouble.
How did you even know that you could do an impression of Margaret Thatcher? How did that come about?
How did it come? There was a wonderful man called Mike Yarwood, a lovely guy, still going, and he did all the politicians. He did people like Harold Wilson and James Callaghan and all those people of the 1970s that only people over the age of 70 now have ever heard of. And he was brilliant, and he did Dennis Healy, but he couldn't do Margaret Thatcher.
And that's where you came in.
And I thought, well, I'll have a go at that, you know, because I did the same impressions. Any impressionist of the 1970s basically did their version of
But at the time of
youth.
making the show, were you kind of like, you know, in taking breath at some of the sketches? Because it was the first time that really politicians were treated so aggressively in satire.
You're absolutely right. And I think that Spitting Image didn't change the government. Mrs Thatcher stayed at the time and the Tory government still won. The thing that made the difference that Spitting Image made was deference. Our deference to politicians disappeared during the time of Spitting Image, because we started to do things and also the royal family. Those are the two areas where I think Spitting Image didn't change the government, but it changed attitude towards the royal family. There was less deference towards the royal family, and we're seeing that being played out.
Did it bring down the Conservative government under John Major? I only say that because my abiding memory of Spitting Image is him obviously completely grey, saying to Norma, more peas. I mean, it completely ridiculed him as Prime Minister.
Well, there's the other point about Spitting Image. It's about perception. And he was, our take on him was that he was a grey man. Steve Bell in The Guardian had a different take. We discovered that that John Major tucked his shirt into his underpants.
Yes, that's right. I
do you remember
that? Yes, I do.
And that's great because it keeps your shirt not falling out. But the bad thing is that if your trousers fall down, you can see your underpants, which nobody wants to see. So, so Steve Bell put the underpants on the outside of his trousers, which made him look like a very, very amateur Superman, which is sort of what he was.
Yes.
Actually, John Major was far more effective as a Prime Minister than we gave him credit for. But he had what we were trying to say about was he had a suburban mind.
Yes.
And he was in a line that I had was he was a retail mind in a wholesale business.
But what would you make of today's crop? I mean, are any of them interesting enough to parody? How would you, for instance, think about doing Rishi Sunak these days?
Well, Enoch Powell was bonkers.
Yes.
Bonkers though he was, he made one point very, he was very sensible one point. He said, the office of Prime Minister is the one job in British politics that is achieved purely by accident.
So Rishi Sunak being summed up perfectly.
And he's found himself, you know, to me, he's the board have all essentially assassinated each other, and this lower middle management sort of employee of the week guy has suddenly found himself in charge of government.
Would you kind of parody his kind of slightly Jackanory delivery at times? I mean, can you do Sunak? Are you working on it?
No, well, I slightly stopped doing politicians when they got rid of Anne Widdecombe. Because I thought that was a wonderful voice.
A friend to GB News.
No, but I know she's a great friend of GB News. But the thing look, I think with politicians and the way they look, Rishi Sunak, I mean, he wears his trousers, you know, up. So his trousers don't fit. And that's a great point because, you know, he isn't quite right for the job. So therefore you should make his suit not fit him.
Well, I think his trousers are often a little too small. Anyway, on that note with Stephen Naylor, and thank you very much indeed for joining me today. It's been a busy show, breaking news. We've had a sacking. Who knows what might happen next week? All you need to do is tune in from 9:30. Thanks for joining me.
This year on GB News, we've got brand new members in the family.
Join us. Across the entire United Kingdom, we cover the issues that matter to you.
GB News will always stay honest, balanced and fair. We want to hear whatever is on your mind.
And we don't talk down to you.
The establishment had their chance.
Now we're here to represent you.
Britain's watching.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
It's something that you would never want anyone to suffer.
I didn't know what channels there were. I didn't think I'd be believed.
I must have weighed about 7 stone and I'm 5'8".
My instincts was to sort of cover this up. I mean, clearly that was a mistake.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good morning and welcome to Sunday with Michael Portillo, bringing you good conversation, arts and entertainment, ethical dilemmas and a sense of the ridiculous too. Well, it was impossible to imagine that Nadhim Zahawi, having paid an enormous tax penalty, could champion the Conservative Party's next election campaign as party chairman. And so, a couple of hours ago, the Prime Minister fired him. Is Rishi damaged by the delay in sacking him, or is he to be commended for pursuing natural justice? Will Dominic Raab be dismissed next? After a rapist who identifies as a woman was transferred to a men's prison in Scotland, does Nicola Sturgeon not believe in our own policy of self-certifying your gender? And the doomsday clock stands has moved closer to midnight. This signals our proximity to nuclear disaster. Does it do any good, or does it just scare us all? And 60 years since spy Kim Philby defected to the Soviet Union, we'll examine the world of espionage and treason. All of that and a wee dram of whiskey too, after the news with Bethany Elsey.
Michael, thank you. Good morning. It's just 1 minute past 11 o'clock. I'm Bethany Elsey with your top stories in the GB newsroom. Nadhim Zahawi has been sacked from government after an ethics inquiry found a serious breach of the ministerial code. The former Tory party chair faced questions over his tax affairs after admitting he paid a penalty to HMRC for an error linked to his shares in the polling company YouGov. In a letter, Mr Zahawi assured the Prime Minister he'll continue to support the government from the backbenches in the coming years. MP Jacob Rees-Mogg says he has sympathy for him.
The report seems to show that he made some technical errors with his declarations under the ministerial code, and the Prime Minister has decided that they were serious enough to fire him. So I feel sorry for Nadhim Zahawi, but I think that after it dominating the headlines for a week, the rule of politics is that if you do that, it's very hard to remain in office.
The Housing Secretary has admitted that faulty government guidance allowed the Grenfell Tower tragedy to happen. Michael Gove says the whole system of building safety wasn't policed effectively enough. He's expected to announce a 6-week deadline for developers tomorrow, forcing them to sign a contract to either fix their unsafe homes or be banned from building new ones. The fire at the residential tower block in West London in 2017 killed 72 people. Boris Johnson was reportedly told to stop asking Richard Sharp for advice about his personal financial matters just 2 weeks before he was announced as the new chair of the BBC. According to the Sunday Times, Mr Johnson, who was Prime Minister at the time, was warned by officials to stop discussions in December 2020. Mr Sharp, a former banker, is facing calls to resign after it emerged he introduced the Prime Minister to a guarantor for a loan. The government will publish an urgent emergency care plan tomorrow to try and tackle pressures facing the NHS. It comes as the Health Department have announced plans to build virtual beds, caring for tens of thousands of elderly and vulnerable people at home. The Health Secretary admitted there was no quick fix, but said this immediate action to shift care away from hospitals will reduce waiting times. The former Conservative advisor Claire Purcell told GB News she's concerned about whether some health problems might be missed.
With elderly people, if they have had a fall or they're not feeling very well, to then have the added bonus of technology on top of it that they may not have access to, they may not be confident with, and also may not have Wi-Fi links at home. Not all older people do. The majority are very, very good, but some won't. And I do worry that that personal contact, things are going to be missed.
In the US, the specialised police unit that included the 5 Memphis officers charged with the murder of Tyree Nichols has been permanently disbanded. It comes as protests continued across several cities after police body cam video was released showing the officers beating the 29-year-old. He died 3 days later. In a phone call, the Nichols family and their lawyer have urged